am honored today to be able to introduce Chuck Berry, who is the president of the American Short Line and Regional Railroad Association. The association represents privately owned freight carriers, and there are about 600, and there's 600 suppliers or so, about 500 railroads and then 600 suppliers. Prior to joining the association as its president, he spent 15 years lobbying and additional few years in policy work on railroads. So I will turn it over to Chuck.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me here. I think Lynn introduced me as Chuck Berry, who's actually much cooler than me. I think he was the founder of modern rock and roll. I'm just the president of the Short Line Railroad Association. I'm Chuck Baker, which is if this was billed as Chuck Berry, I apologize profusely. Right. But no, thank you so much for the introduction and the invitation. Julie, who works with me at the association, I think helped coordinate this. So thank you for Julie. It's a great idea. I've actually never been to a Rotary Club meeting before. I'm well aware of the Rotary Club and the Rotarians, and it's I'd say sort of arguably the most famous of all the civil society organizations in the United States, maybe up there with Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. My kid's a Girl Scout. My wife runs the troop. Obviously, I work at a trade association, which is sort of another version of civil society. My wife studies civil society in Middle East and North Africa. She'd actually probably be a better speaker than me if you want her in the future. She does all sorts of interesting stuff with Tunisia and the elections and democracy. But I think it's a great group. I didn't actually know as much about all the humanitarian work you all do in the grants. I think that's really tremendous, and it's been around forever, so I feel at home. Railroading has also been around a long time. We've been railroading in the United States since 1827, and it started not far from here with the B&O Railroad, and they've got a great museum just up the road in Baltimore, where I'm from. Actually, the Short Line Association that I get to be president of now has been around since 1913, so I think Rotary International has us beat by a little bit. I believe you all started in 1905, but I guess the DC Foundation started in 1922, apparently 100 years ago. So I've got you beat by a few years on that angle. Okay, all right. Well, then you've got me by a year. Yeah. All right. Well, it's close. We're same time. We're both old. I thought I'd start with sort of why you might care about freight railroading in general. And I would say I didn't expect to have anyone here who knew much about freight railroading. And then I'm sitting up here at the head table with the founder and managing partner of one of the better known railroad law firms in the country, who's very humble about his legal career. But at least in my world, Baker and Miller is a pretty big deal. And I think Todd started it. So, and then I think I heard somebody over here say that there's some Conrail connection back in the day. Is that right? No? Well, I thought I heard somebody else talk about some railroading background. But so we'll start with sort of why you might care about freight railroading. And I won't do too much audience participation here, but I will start with asking you all a question. And Todd, you can't guess. Who would like to guess how much freight moves in the United States on a per pound or pounds per person per year? So for every American, each one of the 330 million-ish Americans, how many pounds of freight are transported in the United States per year? It's not multiple choice. You just have to throw out a number. 5,000. 1 ton would be 2,000. 4 tons. The answer is 122,000 pounds of freight per person per year. 61 tons. No, right. So, right. Now, I'm not saying that all goes by rail. I'll give you a rail statistic in a second, but that includes, there's some stuff that moves back and forth multiple times, right? And that includes oil and sand and everything shipped by by water and truck and air freight and rail. But rail, and I'll do one more guess and then I'll just talk for a few minutes. Measured by freight ton miles, so giving credit for a given pound counts as 3,000 if it moves across the country versus only 100 if it moves 100 miles. Who would like to guess what % of the freight moves by freight rail? Well, I wish. It's not quite 70.
45.
That's very close. It's 40%. So 40% of freight in the United States, measured by ton miles, moves by freight rail. And that's actually more than any other mode. It's more than trucking, it's more than pipeline, it's more than water, and it's way more than air freight. And those are essentially the 5 ways that freight moves in the country. And what moves by rail? It is essentially everything you can think of, although what moves by rail tends towards the bulkier, heavier commodities. So soybeans, grain, wheat, lumber, chemicals, chlorine, cardboard, paper, and then a whole variety of metals, aluminum, minerals, salt, sand, glass, all that kind of stuff. And then all the finished goods too. Just looking around the room, lots of furniture moves by freight rail, a lot of bottled water moves by freight rail, certainly all the ingredients that went in to the food, and not only some of the finished product food, but the feed for the animals that made it in the first place. So really, essentially everything moves by rail. And why else should one sort of care a little bit about freight rail, or at least why I care so much about freight rail? Every load of freight that moves by rail versus truck, and truck is essentially our big competitor. Every load of freight that moves by rail instead of truck is trucks off the road. So that's a big deal for mobility and traffic and maybe just quality of life. I don't know about you all, but I personally don't really enjoy being on the highway next to giant 18-wheelers getting whipped around by the wind, threatening to kill me and my family. No offense to Chris Spear, the speaker earlier this year. Every load of freight moved by rail is also much safer than truck. It's about 3 to 20 times safer to move a load of freight by rail than truck, depending on how you measure it, whether it's fatalities or injuries or equipment damage or whatever. But you all probably know there is an epidemic, not a pandemic, but an epidemic of highway deaths in this country. It's about 40,000 deaths per year, every year. That number does not go down. It does not budge. It's been about that number for 40 straight years, which is pretty depressing in a society that's supposed to be making progress. But about 5,000 of those 40,000 deaths are directly related to truck traffic. And so we feel good about every load of freight we can get off the highway and onto a privately owned and maintained and separated rail system. And also every load of freight moved by rail as opposed to truck is significantly better for the environment. Compared to truck, a given ton mile on rail is about 1/4, so 4 times better on an emissions front. So that's carbon dioxide emissions, which is sort of the big one that people talk about these days, but also all sorts of other particulate emissions. There's also a kind of a hidden epidemic of microplastics and micro rubber in our society, polluting our oceans and our air. And an awful lot of that comes from truck tires on the road. Railroads have also helped avoid that problem. And then also, and this gets a little wonkier, but is a big deal in my world, every load of freight moved by rail instead of truck is actually a big win for the taxpayer. There's about a $20 billion, that's B, billion with a B, $20 billion a year subsidy just on the federal level for the Highway Trust Fund. And the Highway Trust Fund is kind of a dorky term that we use in DC to talk about how highways are funded. But essentially, there's $20 billion transferred every year from the general fund to a special fund that just goes to pay for the federal highways. A lot of people think that the highways are paid for by the gas tax, and it's not, they're just not fully covered. So it's $20 billion a year of your money, my money, everyone else's money going to subsidize highways. And that's not even counting all the externalities that we talked about with safety and the environment. So those are some of the reasons why people who are not in the industry or shipping by rail might care about freight rail versus truck. And there's also some neat things about railroads. We could do a whole separate conversation on, like, a history moment, and I won't do that, but there's all sorts of neat stuff about the history of railroads, including heavy involvement with the labor movement over time, but also railroads essentially invented the Social Security system. Interestingly, I'm not in Social Security because I work for the railroads or railroad association. I'm in something called railroad retirement, and it actually predates Social Security by about 20 years. So it's very similar, but better, actually. But there's about 500,000 people in this country, including current employees plus retirees, who are not in Social Security and instead are in the railroad retirement system. Railroads also invented time zones. You can probably sort of relatively easily figure out why, because once you had railroads kind of crisscrossing the country and moving at speeds that were significantly north of how people could move before railroads, the fact that there was different time in New York versus Chicago actually became a major problem, whereas that used to not really be something, used to not be a relevant problem for people. So railroads essentially invented time zones. Railroads also essentially invented barcodes to keep track of what's in various rail cars. And there's a whole lengthy story about other kind of cool stuff that came out of railroads. I'm going to scroll through some of my other notes here because I'm cognizant of the time. But short lines. So I represent the Short Line Railroad Association. So we are freight railroads, but we're not probably the ones you've heard of, right? So there's a few freight railroad household names in this country: Norfolk Southern, CSX, Union Pacific, BNSF, Kansas City Southern, Canadian National, Canadian Pacific. Those are the 7 biggest freight railroads in the United States. Those are called the Class 1 railroads. The other 600, and most people would have no idea there's 600 other ones. The other 600 are the small ones. Short lines is actually kind of a colloquial term. Technically, if you care, it's a class system. So the big ones are the Class 1 railroads. We're the Class 2 and 3 railroads. Essentially means we're the small ones. The way to think about it is we're essentially the branch lines. Like, we're the first mile, last mile. We tend to be in less busy places, tend to be in rural America and kind of special circumstances, lighter density areas. For people who fly, like, think American Eagle versus American, or United Express versus United. Without giving you a whole boring history lesson, if you go back 40 or 50 years, the big railroads were struggling to make money on their big main lines, and they were losing money and definitely not making money on their lower density kind of branch lines. And the question at the time was either, do you abandon those lines, which I think everybody would agree is kind of a bad result for everyone in the country, or can you sell them off? And there was a deregulatory action by Jimmy Carter called the Staggers Act in 1980, same time that trucking and airlines were also deregulated partially, that allowed the big railroads to essentially spin off or sell their unprofitable branch lines to local entrepreneurs. So instead of being the unprofitable, uncared about kind of bastard stepchild of Union Pacific, for instance, that went from Evansville to Stevensville, they would sell that to a local entrepreneur who probably lived in Evansville. And that guy would take the railroad and rename it. And now it's the Evansville and Stevensville Railroad. And that becomes a short line. And that has a couple advantages. That guy, first of all, can run a railroad with a much lower cost structure than Union Pacific used to do it. He'll be president of the railroad. He'll also sometimes operate the trains, maybe on Tuesday and Thursday. His wife will probably manage the office. His cousin might maintain the track. And instead of 300 big fancy brand new locomotives, he gets one hand-me-down locomotives and finds his friend who's a mechanic who can kind of keep the thing running. And you run a much lower cost kind of bootstrap operation. So that's one. Two, if you live in Evansville and you run the Evansville and Stevensville Railroad, your entire life becomes marketing and selling the Evansville and Stevensville Railroad. So you become a member of the Evansville Chamber of Commerce. You maybe become a member of the Evansville Rotary Club. Right. You spend all day, every day trying to get one more carload of freight onto the Evansville and Stevensville Railroad. So they do that successfully, and that's, multiplied 600 times across the country. And then you also can get some government support. The big Class 1 railroads proudly, and good for them, they're our partners, really don't take any government funding at all. They care a lot about government policies and they don't want their trucking friends to be subsidized too much, but they don't ask or they don't get any federal government support with grants or taxes. Short lines, we happily take any support we can get. So short lines go out and ask, they get asked for some state funds and some federal funds to invest in our infrastructure. It's a drop in the bucket or pales in comparison to our friends in the trucking industry, but we do get some, and that helps us keep the lights on at some of these railroads. So that's essentially the difference between short lines and class ones. And I'm gonna fly through the rest of these notes here and kind of just tell you very briefly some of our big focus areas for, over the past year and the next year or two. The infrastructure bill was a huge deal for us. I think it was a nice result for the country, frankly, but for us in particular, it's going to about quadruple the amount of federal funding that is available for us to compete for. We don't get any of it automatically, but we get to apply for grants to the Federal Railroad Administration, and it used to be about $300 million a year was available for us to compete for. Now it's going to be over $1.2 billion this year, and that should be similar for the next 5 years. I think that's a huge win for the country. I think in theory, at least, we have finite resources and can't just borrow endless amounts of money, although that we test that theory sometimes. But I do think for every given dollar, this country underinvests in hard infrastructure and perhaps overinvests in some perhaps less productive ways to spend our money. I think the infrastructure bill was a step in pushing that back in the right direction, and is going to have to be more what infrastructure investment looks like over the next couple of decades as we come to terms with the fact that as a country, we've really been coasting on infrastructure that was built 70, 80, 90, 100, 110 years ago at this point. Look at Jackson, Mississippi for the latest example of it's a major state capital whose water system just no longer functions, right? And that's the kind of thing that's not going to be okay. So we're going to have to fix that as a country. So the infrastructure bill was a big win, and a big win for short lines. Two, there's constantly regulatory issues that we're worrying about on the freight railroad side. We have our own safety regulatory agency called the Federal Railroad Administration, and we have our own economic regulatory agency called the Surface Transportation Board, which for history fans is the kind of successor to the old Interstate Commerce Commission, which if you go back 70 years ago, arguably the second most powerful job in the United States behind President of the United States was chairman of the Interstate Commerce Commission. Being chairman of the Surface Transportation Board is not that big of a deal anymore because we're a little smaller than we used to be, but nonetheless, it's a big deal for us. Third, we're constantly focused on our environmental footprint. I talked about our profile earlier on how attractive it is versus trucking, but we are very, very cognizant of the pressure coming from society that whatever we do today is not going to be good enough tomorrow. So there's a lot of effort to get freight railroading even cleaner than it has been. And there's a lot of work on upgrading locomotives, stop-start technology, anti-idle technology, track lubrication, electrifying locomotives, running cleaner kind of biogas fuels as opposed to fossil fuels, that sort of thing. And then the fourth thing that we're focused on is making rail easier to use. Probably most of you, or probably none of you would know this unless you happen to own a company that ships by rail, but we are sort of a hassle to use. We are significantly cheaper than trucking. And so if you're moving large quantities of stuff, you're going to want to use rail, but we don't do a great job of making it easy. And so if you all go home and if you don't have to give up the pizza, like the previous speaker recommended, but if you still are able to afford pizza and you order pepperoni pizza on Domino's, you can go on your app and it'll tell you the name of the guy putting the pepperoni on your pizza, the name of the person checking your pizza, the name of the person driving it to you, and where it is. And that pizza was like $8. But if you put $1 million worth of lumber on a unit train of coal and you give it to the railroad, they will essentially tell you, like, we'll get it to your destination in 4 days. And if it's not there, call us. And like, we won't really tell you where it is. You certainly can't track it live unless you put your own GPS sensor on it. We won't give you an updated ETA. You had to call a bunch of people to figure it out. Like you have to call somebody to check on it. There's not an easy app that works across the whole industry. So I think that's a little embarrassing. A lot of us think that's a little embarrassing. We are behind the times on that. We need to fix it. So those are the big four things we're working on. And then one other thing I'd offer, again, kind of related to the history moment, but because it's in the news, we are in the middle, or hopefully towards the end of a very big national labor negotiation with our unions. There's 115,000 unions, or 115,000 workers who are represented by about a dozen unions who are in negotiations with 40 of the biggest railroads. It's been 2 years since we've had a new labor contract. There was a presidential emergency board appointed about 5 weeks ago. They came out with recommendations about a week ago, and we have about 3 weeks left to get an agreement before self-help becomes an option. And self-help means a strike. A strike would be, in theory, and I don't mean to scare anyone, but in theory, completely disastrous for the United States economy. I would say it's extraordinarily unlikely rail will be shut down. If there is a strike, it's very, very likely Congress would quickly order everyone back to work and to figure it out. That's what traditionally happens. But you will see this more and more in the news over the next few weeks if we don't get it figured out. And I think it's probably fair to say that the big railroads do not currently have the best of relations with their labor unions. And obviously we've seen nationwide, there's sort of the great resignation or the great reshuffling or the great rethinking of work. And that's happening with railroad workers too. And it's a real challenge. And this labor union negotiation comes at a tricky time. So we're dealing with that. And I don't know if I left any time at all for questions, but I'd be happy to take some.
My 91-year-old dad is actually one of your members. When he was a lobbyist for Ford Motor Company, he did a big event for you along with, Pullman, Santa Fe, and they made him an honorary member of your association. He's also a fanatical model railroader, having grown up in the age of steam. He's a master model railroader for the National Model Railroaders Association.
I will say there is some overlap between folks in my association and model railroad. There's some people, like the chairman of my board is an obsessive model railroader. And then there's lots of people in my association who kind of like roll their eyes at model railroading and say like, no, I like to play with real trains, not toy trains. So it's kind of like a split in the industry, but I think it's great.
How do the short lines integrate with the main lines to get the equipment they need, because they have to ship on something, and then once they get whatever's loaded, it has to be handed off to the main line. So how does that work?
Right.
In terms of setting rates and et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Well, that's sort of two separate questions. I'll answer them separately. On the physical interchange, there's essentially an interchange point where, so 100% of short lines connect with class ones, and essentially like close to 100% of short line shipments have to go either to or from a class one, or to or from or both. There's almost no shipments that stay entirely on a short line. So every short line has an interchange point with a class one railroad, or multiple interchange points with multiple class one railroads. And they essentially, like it's probably about how you'd imagine. They pull up with their locomotive with the cars behind it, and they unhook the cars, and the class one will hook it to their locomotive, and they're off. They're all using essentially standardized equipment. The tracks are the same. It's the same type of railroading. If you looked and saw a short line versus a class one, they don't necessarily look different. Although if you stood by a class one line versus a short line for a day, you might see 30 or 40 trains go across the class one with brand new fancy equipment. And you might see 1 or 2 trains a day go across the short line with like old broken down equipment. But basically they interchange. The rate question is a long, complicated answer, but in short, some short lines get to set their own rates and kind of have the prime relationship with the customer. Most short lines are kind of a taker of the rate that the class one would give them. The class one would say to Ford, for instance, hey, we'll move your cars $3,000 per carload, 1,000 miles, and that last 40 miles is on a short line, and we'll give the short line $200 per car. And the short line just kind of has to say like, thank you, sir. So most times we're kind of a taker of the rate.
Thank you for Maybelline and Roll Over Beethoven. Those were good songs, Chuck Berry. And how do you access the money in the infrastructure bill? You didn't say, you said it was a big plus, but how do you get it?
Sure. So it's a discretionary grant program. It's run through the Federal Railroad Administration. So they open what they call a NOFO, a Notice of Funding Opportunity, once a year, and they put it out publicly. I send like obsessive, crazy number of emails to all my members, making sure that they've seen it. And then they have to put in pretty elaborate applications, and it's hard to apply. You have to do a benefit cost analysis and environmental analysis and all this work. It's probably a good $50,000 worth of effort just to apply, but for the chance to win, $10 million to upgrade your track, it's worth the effort. Yeah. Yeah, you can't ignore your online.
Go ahead, Dennis.
Okay, I have a couple questions. I enjoyed your presentation. As you know, in Germany, they've had 2 trains running on hydrogen for about 2 to 3 years. However, we don't see that in the United States. Also, there's a lot of confusion about the use of hydrogen, but there's never any money from the government at any level to support testing like they're doing in Germany and France. As you probably know, in China, they just put into service something like 2,000 buses operating on hydrogen. There's not any place in the United States where that is going on. My company, for example, produces 11 tons a day of green hydrogen.
Well, your point is noted. I would say there's a little bit of testing going on with freight railroads in the United States with hydrogen, but I would agree with your frustration that there's not been really much federal funding on that. I do think that climate bill from last month may provide some opportunities on that front. So hopefully stand by for good news eventually.
Thank you so much. And on behalf of the Rotary Club of Washington, D.C., I am pleased and proud to present you with the certificate signifying our commitment to plant a tree in your honor to improve and beautify the environment. And we are so high tech, we have GPS coordinates for our trees. So you will be getting that information, and we do planting ceremonies, and we'll be inviting you to that. So thank you.
Thank you.